Prince set his glass down on the table and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the night. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the music, not the silence that followed it. Just Prince, mid-sentence, lowering his drink with a carefulness that had nothing to do with the conversation he'd been having a moment before. Michael was at the piano across the room. He hadn't announced anything. He hadn't asked if anyone wanted to hear something. He'd simply moved through the party the way he always moved through rooms he wasn't entirely comfortable in, quietly without taking up too much space, and then sat down at the bench and placed his hands on the keys. The house was in Hollywood Hills, November 2007. 18 months had passed since Michael had come back from Bahrain, and the people who knew him well enough to read him knew he was still not entirely back. Not in the way he used to be. Something in him remained elsewhere. The gathering was small, maybe 20 people. Old friends, a few musicians, a producer or two. The kind of evening where nobody talks about work unless they can't help it. Prince had arrived 40 minutes late. He and Michael had spoken briefly near the entrance. The kind of exchange between two men who respect each other enough to be honest and know each other well enough to be careful. They'd been in each other's orbit for 20 years. Not friends exactly, not rivals in any simple sense of the word. Something harder to name than either of those things. When Michael sat down at the piano, the room didn't stop immediately. It kept going for a few seconds. Someone laughed at something near the back. A glass clinked. Then the first chord arrived. It wasn't loud. It wasn't designed to pull attention. It was the kind of sound that finds you before you've decided to listen. 4 notes descending in a sequence that had no obvious origin, nothing anyone in that room had heard before, and yet something about it felt like a memory someone couldn't quite place. People stopped one at a time, not together, the way a crowd thins before a storm. Prince stopped talking. He turned toward the piano. He didn't move toward it, just stood there, glass already on the table, arms at his sides, listening with the particular stillness of someone who has just recognized something they thought was gone. To understand what that melody did to Prince, you have to go back 20 years. In the winter of 1987, Michael had been working on Bad for almost 2 years. The pressure surrounding that album was unlike anything he'd carried before. He was 30 years old. The world was watching him the way it watches someone who has done the impossible once, with the quiet, persistent question of whether they can do it again. He was spending long stretches of time at Electric Lady Studios in New York. Late nights mostly, sometimes into the morning. He'd always worked that way, in private, in the hours when the building was mostly empty. There was a Steinway in the back room of Studio A. Michael had started spending time there between sessions, not rehearsing, not recording, just playing, working through something that wasn't connected to Bad, something more personal than anything on that album was going to be. A piece for piano. No vocals, no production, just melody and a chord structure that kept returning to the same unresolved place, as if the music was carrying a question it knew couldn't be answered. He called it Before the Rain. He never wrote that title down anywhere someone else could find it. It was the most private thing he had ever composed. And in December of that year, on a night when Prince happened to be finishing his own sessions in Studio B just down the hall, Michael made a decision he would spend years quietly regretting. He invited Prince to hear it. They weren't close, but they were close enough. 2 musicians who had grown up measuring themselves against each other's success without ever saying so directly. Michael thought Prince might understand what the piece was reaching for, that he might be the right person for something this unguarded. Prince listened to all of it. He sat in the back room with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, and he heard every note to the end. When it finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's too soft, Mike. It doesn't go anywhere. Nobody's going to want to feel that." He wasn't being cruel. Michael understood that later, when he had enough distance to look at it clearly. Prince was being honest the way people are honest when they believe they're helping. He was applying his own understanding of what music is for to something that hadn't been made for an audience at all. But that's not how it landed. Michael closed the piano. He thanked Prince for listening. He gathered the handwritten pages he'd been working from and drove back to Encino without turning on the radio. He never played Before the Rain for anyone again. The piece went somewhere quiet inside him, the way things do when they've been exposed too early, before they were ready to survive contact with another person's judgment. He kept it, but he kept it private. The recordings he'd made on a small cassette player during those late Electric Lady nights went into a box. Nobody asked about them. He didn't offer them. Bad came out in 1987 and did what it was always going to do. Life moved forward, louder and faster than the private things can keep up with. The years that followed were not kind to Michael in the ways that don't make the front page. He won things and lost things and rebuilt and fell and rebuilt again. And by 2005, he was standing in a Santa Barbara courtroom, watching 14 months of his life reduce itself to a verdict. When it was finally over, he left the country. Bahrain was quiet in a way California never was. He spent months there, then moved to Ireland, then Vegas, circling without quite landing. The people who stayed close to him describe a man who was still completely himself in small moments and completely elsewhere in others. He came back to Los Angeles in 2006 and started talking about new music. But something in the way he moved through those conversations told the people around him that he was also aware, in some new way, of how much time had passed. He'd start a sentence about the future, and somewhere in the middle of it, something would shift. He'd be briefly somewhere else, then come back. In the fall of 2007, he started going through old recordings, not to work on them, just to listen. A close associate later described Michael pulling out tapes he hadn't touched in years and sitting with them alone for hours, not making notes, not producing anything, just listening, the way you listen when you're taking stock of something before it gets away from you. He didn't tell anyone he had found the cassette, but the same associate noticed that in the weeks before the Hollywood Hills gathering in November, Michael had been quieter than usual in a way that felt deliberate rather than withdrawn. Like something had been decided, like he had made up his mind about something that didn't need to be discussed. Back in the Hollywood Hills living room, Michael played the whole piece. He didn't introduce it. He didn't say where it came from or when he'd written it or who had heard it before. He just played it, beginning to end, exactly as he had played it in that Electric Lady back room 20 years ago, except now there was something different in his hands. Less asking, more knowing. The unresolved chord at the center of it didn't sound like a question anymore. It sounded like an acknowledgement. The room held its silence for the entire duration. Prince didn't move from where he was standing. He listened with his jaw loose and his eyes fixed somewhere slightly above the piano. And if the people nearby noticed what was happening on his face, they were careful enough not to look directly at it. When Michael lifted his hands from the keys, the room sat with it for a moment. Then Prince walked over. He moved past the people near him without speaking, past the cluster of guests near the center of the room, all the way to the bench where Michael was still sitting. He didn't rush. He didn't draw attention to himself. He just went. He said something close to Michael's ear. Nobody heard the exact words. What they could see was Michael receiving them, with his head slightly down and his hands still in his lap, and then a slow nod, and then something in his posture that had been held for a very long time, quietly setting itself down. Prince put his hand briefly on Michael's shoulder. Then he stepped back. The room gradually returned to itself. Conversations restarted slowly, carefully, the way they restart after something true has moved through a space and rearranged everything it touched. Prince retrieved his glass from the table. He held it for a while without drinking from it. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. The coroner listed the time of death as 2:26 in the afternoon. Prince said very little publicly. He was never the kind of man who talked about the things that cost him something in public. He gave one brief interview in which he spoke around the edges of grief without touching the center of it, and deflected the rest with a grace that looked like composure, but was closer to protection. On June 27th, the BET Awards became something nobody in that building had prepared for. Performers paid tribute. Speeches were made. The grief in the room was enormous and genuine. And then Prince walked onto the stage. He performed Purple Rain the way he always performed it, with total authority, nothing held back. He played through the whole arc of it, and then, near the end, in the place where the solo climbs and opens into something that resists resolution, he let it drop. 4 notes descending, the same 4 notes from a piano piece written in the back room of a recording studio in New York in December 1987, and played once more in a Hollywood Hills living room in November 2007. He held those notes for maybe 6 seconds. Then he brought it back to Purple Rain and finished. Most of the people in that arena had no idea what they just heard, but they felt it. Something arrived through a channel that had no name. A door opened briefly into a room that only one other person had ever been in, and then it closed again. Prince stood at the microphone after the last note faded and looked up. Just briefly, just long enough, before walking off the stage. There is a cassette recording that has never been officially released. Someone involved with Michael's estate mentioned in 2012 that they had found several tapes in a box labeled only with a year, 1986. Piano pieces, no vocals, no production, no overdubs. Raw recordings made alone in a room late at night. Among them was one piece that nobody in the estate could immediately identify. Unresolved, deeply private. When they played it for a consultant who had worked with Michael in the late 80s, she listened through once and asked for a minute before saying anything. When she came back, she said she couldn't name it, but the chord structure reminded her of something she'd heard Michael working through during a session, very late, when he didn't realize anyone was still in the building. She described it as the sound of someone not performing for anything, just working something out. The estate hasn't made a decision about releasing it. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. Some things are not diminished by staying private. Some things are exactly what they are because they were never made to be heard by everyone. Michael played Before the Rain once for Prince, who told him it was too soft. 20 years later, he played it again, in a room where nobody was going to tell him anything. And this time, Prince walked across the floor to say the thing he should have said in 1987. In a back room in New York, when a man sat down and played him the most honest thing he'd ever written, and the wrong answer came out. 6 seconds at the BET Awards was the right one.